You may have seen a demo in Glasgow a couple of months ago about or where two, I suppose, illegal immigrants were prevented from being arrested by the immigration police. I want to play you the clip from the BBC now.
Today, Glasgow community is united to basically say this is unacceptable. The two men are being released into my custody. They will not be arrested, they will not be detained, and they will be released.
Okay, you would think that the city of Glasgow had just won the World Cup on behalf of the whole of the UK there. Right, now there's also an article in The Guardian about it. Let me just scroll down a bit. Glasgow protesters rejoice as men freed after immigration van standoff. And then another one from Al Jazeera. They're kind of gloaty. What they're at pains to say is it was not Muslims or BLM people or anti-racist campaigners. This appears to have been ordinary ethnic Scots coming out at very short notice in the hundreds, which it was. If you look at the tweets that they publish here, they're all by looks like ethnic Scots to me. Sawyer Hackett, this is incredible. Leah Cowan, she's saying this is anti-racist politics are based on a profound belly-deep knowledge that we can and must fight back literally against huge structures of oppression that seek to divide our communities. No justice, no peace. And then Hazel Martin and Paul Fitzgerald, people power at its best. Nice little rainbow there. Now, so the thing is, I mean, that's really gloaty stuff from Al Jazeera, but there is a grain of truth to it. I think they're right. Now, what I want to do is to compare that absurd demo where hundreds of people, the reason I think hundreds of people came out at short notice is because the BBC called this a swoop by the immigration police. So it must, well, unless the demonstrators had notice, I can't see how they would have, then that was pretty much a spontaneous demo. And now I want to compare that with the numbers who turned out at short notice with the how few people voted for nationalist or patriotic parties at the Batley and Spen by-election. This shows what a bad state we are in. Okay, this is an article from the Independent. Again, they're gloating good and proper. Batley and Spen by-election. Far-right candidates lose deposits, win under 2% of vote and sink without trace. Okay, far-right candidates have sunk without trace in Batley and Spen by-election by losing their deposits and winning just 1.4% of the vote combined. 5 extreme right-wing and nationalist groups contested the seat where former MP Joe Cox was murdered by a neo-Nazi in 2016. So how badly did they do? Well, the 5 parties they're referring to there, the top one was the English Democrats. They got 207 votes. UKIP, which according to the Independent is a far-right party now, 151 votes. And then down the bottom you've got Anne-Marie Waters got 97 votes, and Jada Franson, she got formerly of Britain First, she got 50 votes, and the Heritage Party got 33 votes. In total, I think that was just over 500 votes, 1.4% of the total votes. And what I want to look at is the quote from Brendan Cox, who was the husband to Joe Cox, the MP who got murdered. He was cruel, harsh, but probably right, okay, in general. Well, the reality is those far-right groups have sunk without a trace, he told the Independent. Yep, it's probably right. These are all individuals on their own petty little ego trips. Well, I think he's the one being petty there. None of them have anything resembling a political movement or force behind them. Unfortunately, I think he's right there. The fact there are almost half a dozen of them, well, that means 5, is an indicator of their weakness and irrelevance, certainly not their popularity or prestige. Fighting talk but accurate, harsh but fair. Okay, now what I wanted to explain is why that is happening. What the reason that I think you are getting that absurd demo in London in favour of what looks like 2 illegal immigrants, preventing them from being arrested, obstructing the police in the execution of their duty, which ordinarily you'd call in the riot police, you'd crack heads, those hundreds of people would be stuffed in cells, brought before the magistrates on Monday morning and given 500 quid fines or maybe a suspended sentence. But no, the immigration police said, right, we're going to let the guys go. And they were those fellas were then walked down to the mosque. So I think we know what their background was. Okay, now what I want to explain is how that can happen, and also how so few votes can be secured by patriotic nationalist parties at that by-election when there is such a serious problem, such a profound, deeply rooted problem, the problem of mass immigration and ethnic and racial identity, the problem of cultural dilution, cultural invasion. I think people are aware, people understand the numbers, people understand the cultural threat, people understand the demographic threat, people understand the intimidation, the harm that's done to cities and towns and communities. And that is, people understand that the water is moving fast beneath the ice, but how can people still do those absurd things? I think the reason is because the politics of racial and ethnic identity act as the spearhead politics of guilt, acting as a battering ram, pushing through the politics of identity and entitlement in general. They're the hardened tip of the politics of entitlement. And we pretty much, all of us, most of us share those politics of entitlement. For most of us, it's the politics of economic entitlement based on our economic identity, i.e. that we belong to the bottom, the poorest 90% of the population, i.e. most of us. And if what people want, people focus on survival, and survival in a modern welfare democracy means the welfare state. Even if we don't think of ourselves as being welfare dependent, it's the health service, it's schools, it's policing, it's old age care, all kinds of things that we take for granted, that we kind of have come to depend on. And so that means that we want to push those politics of entitlement because they give us the free stuff. And the politics of racial and ethnic entitlement, we may grumble about them. We find it ugly, we find it absurd, but most of us won't do anything about it. And you can see this reflected in the way that the organisations that are pro the racial and ethnic minority politics, Refugees Welcome, BLM, being pro-Muslim, Hope Not Hate, that they are far more respectable at a dinner party. To utter their sentiments won't get you ostracised at a dinner party. If you say refugees welcome, the conversation won't go silent. If you say refugees unwelcome, the conversation may well go silent for a little while. So it's simply because those politics of identity, those are in tune with the politics of economic identity and entitlement that we all share, and they're particularly the politics of entitlement are particularly acute in Scotland, which is getting welfare way beyond its means and resents the English for it, even though, or resents the UK for it, even though the UK is very substantially artificially propping it up. Now I want to explain what I mean by this. I'm not having a go at Scotland here, I'm just using Scotland as a sample, a specimen. We are like Scotland, but in a more diluted form. Scotland is an interesting example to look at. Now, what I want to do is describe the economic situation in Scotland. And I'll deal with this article from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And I'll just read out the summary. Today's government expenditure and revenue Scotland figures show Scotland's implicit budget deficit increasing to 8.6% of GDP in 2019 to 20, around 6 percentage points higher than the UK as a whole, largely reflecting higher government spending. The COVID-19 crisis means that figures for the current and the next few years are likely to differ massively though. Indeed, the UK's actual and Scotland's implicit budget deficit this year could spike at almost 19% and 26 to 28% of GDP respectively, based on Office for Budget Responsibility projections. And ongoing economic weakness means that the deficits will likely remain elevated even in 2024 to 25. So that's the Scottish situation. And what that leads people to do every so often is to wonder how many net taxpayers there are in Scotland. There are two articles I found referred to, but they've both been scrubbed, but I found them referred to. This Guardian article refers to a Daily Mail article by Max Hastings. Max Hastings, writing in the Mail, is all in favour of a split. He says only 163,000 of the 5 million Scots are net taxpayers when all reliefs and subsidies are discounted. That is 3.3% of the population, i.e. 1 in 30 Scots being a net taxpayer. I suspect that exaggerates the number of net taxpayers in Scotland, because often these calculations are based on things that are pure welfare, so money that you get handed to you, rather than benefits that you get like roads or police or the army, which we normally don't think of as welfare payments. Now, there's another article, Theodore Dalrymple in City Journal. I recall the article that he's referring to here. Not long ago, for example, The Spectator published an article claiming that there were only 15,000 net taxpayers in all of Scotland. That is to say approximately 0.03% of the population. I think he means 0.3, i.e. What's that, I think 1 in 300, something like that. I mean, that's a tiny amount. We don't really know. I think it's too difficult to calculate, but the number of net taxpayers is probably very small. And that's why Scotland's budget deficit is so high. Now, this is propped up Scotland's budget deficit is propped up in two ways. First of all, something called the Barnett formula. Secondly, something called the Smith Commission. Now, I'll deal with the Barnett formula. Well, this is a BBC article. What is the Barnett formula? For 42 years, public spending across Northern Ireland, Scotland, England and Wales have been based around something called the Barnett formula. In principle, the way this works is extremely simple. When the UK government decides to spend more or less on things such as health and education in England, the Barnett formula is used to decide how much money the other nations receive. For example, if health spending increases by £100 per person in England, the devolved governments should receive the equivalent amount. The exact amount is based on the size of their population. However, the devolved governments are free to spend any extra money on whatever they want. Funding doesn't have to go on health just because the money went on health in England. So if £100 per year more gets spent on education in England, Westminster hands over £100 per person more to Scotland, and they can spend it on free beer if they want to. That's basically how that works. And so what you have is the level of welfare and the poverty line set artificially high in Scotland. And what that then means is the Scottish economy getting skewed towards welfare and state jobs, so that it depends on welfare, it depends on state jobs. It is a welfare dependent economy, and that means it is peculiarly susceptible to the politics of economic identity and economic entitlement. And those politics of economic entitlement, they're made all the more bitter and given all the more bite because they have an added an element of ethnic resentment, i.e. the resentment of the Scots for the English, as represented by the Westminster Parliament, who just will not hand over as much money as the Scots feel they're entitled to, which is what happens when you have when people become welfareised. Okay, so that's the Barnett formula. Now, the Smith Commission, that was something set up by David Cameron. You could have guessed it. After the independence referendum in 2014, Cameron wanted to play nice to preserve the Union. This is typical national politician stuff. Most English people probably, on balance, aren't particularly bothered one way or the other. If the Scots want to go, they can go. That is unacceptable to a politician. It would mean a reduction in their power, and that's unacceptable to a power addict, which politicians are. It also means that they're the people who are said to have been on watch when the union broke up. It's just not. It would interrupt their careers, which is not permissible. So they're not going to allow it. So they'll do anything they can to try and patch things up, and they do that via money. The Smith Commission made a bunch of recommendations. I think the main ones were that it gave Scotland the power to raise extra taxes within Scotland and to borrow money, and that was put into law by the Scotland Act of 2016. Now, you might say, well, that's okay if Scotland wants to borrow money or tax itself in order to spend on whatever it likes. That's Scotland's business. That's not my business. Good luck to them. The problem with that is Scotland remains part of the UK, and that means that the debts that it builds up, its deficits, are backstopped, bankrolled, and potentially bailed out by the UK. Because if Scotland goes bankrupt and falls off the cliff, then Westminster is going to have to rescue it. It's going to have to prop it up again, the reason is the international markets, which deal in UK bonds and UK and the pound and exchange rates, they're not going to say that was Scotland, that's a separate part of the UK going bust. They will say that is the UK going partially bust. So what that does, that awareness that there is the Westminster Parliament backstopping Scottish deficits, encourages Scotland to run up bigger deficits, and which again creates a more welfareised society. And that more welfareised society is all the more likely to be tolerant of, or to like, the politics of racial and ethnic identity, which are like a battering ram pushing through the politics of identity, which the politics of welfare depend on. The politics of welfare depend on identity and entitlement. I am a member of the bottom 90% of earners, therefore I'm entitled to money from someone. I want free money. And that way of thinking is really, it's about theft. It's about confiscation without consent. If it was consent, it wouldn't be taxation. You wouldn't need taxation. It would just be donations. And the ideology justifying that is the politics of entitlement and identity. And so that means, in a welfareised society like Scotland, that will make them very susceptible, philosophically and politically, very susceptible to other politics of identity and entitlement. And that is at least for as long as the perception exists that there will always be more money. It's simply a question of getting the government to tax more, to find more money, to come down hard on multinationals, to close up tax loopholes, to prevent tax avoidance, just to put up tax rates on the rich. There will always be more money. So it's not a question of a limited pot that we have to share out. It's a question of pushing harder in order to get more money out of the wealthy. And in those circumstances, racial groups with their politics of guilt and the idea that if you oppose them you're a Nazi, so therefore you can't oppose them, that's very useful when you're trying to batter down resistance to governments to find and spend more money on you. If it ever comes to the stage when there's an economic, just things seize up a bit, you don't have to have a collapse, things just come to a standstill, and people realise there isn't any more money, it's a fixed amount, then people will look at those racial and ethnic identity groups and say, you are not acting as a battering ram, pushing forward our interests. You are a rival group taking a disproportionate share of this fixed welfare pot, and then hostility will arise. You can pretty much, and it will be not very pleasant hostility either. And if you get a complete collapse of the economy, then all bets are off. You will not see any more demos like that one you see in Glasgow, and you will see those nationalist parties that got so few votes in the Batley and Spend by-election getting massively increased share of the votes. Now, in case you think that I've been having a go at the Scots, no. As I said, we are like the Scots, but in a more diluted form. I want to read from this report. It was a report done by a banker, Liddon Consulting, in the aftermath of the Smith Commission. And what he said, his conclusion was, to conclude, Scotland within the UK is on life support. It is an exaggerated version of the UK economy as a whole. Too few people paying tax. We are not that different from the Scots. They are an exaggerated example. They have an exaggerated welfare dependence, but we are similar to them. And I want to explain that by looking at this graph. If you understand this nerdy graph, you understand, broad brush, the politics of the entire Western world, the welfare democracies of the West. This is a graph showing, this is from a BBC article. This graph shows income tax contributions of the top 50% of taxpayers. Now the article is reality check, are lower earners bearing the tax burden? Okay, but this is showing who pays how much into the tax pot. Now light grey, now there's the percentage of income tax receipts, so the total pot that the total income tax pot that the government receives. Light green is the top 1%, mid green is the next 9%, so light green and mid green is the top 10%, and dark green is the next 40%. So those three colours represent the top 50%. What you see in 78 to 79, the top 10%, the top 50% paid about 82% of income tax. And in about 5 years ago, 2015 to 16, the top 50% paid 91% of income tax. Income tax is a good yardstick because other taxes are more broadly spread, like VAT, and some taxes, like capital gains tax, are more narrowly spread. But what you see here, what I want to point out in particular, is the top 10% at the moment paying roughly 60% of all income tax. So more than 50%. That means the bottom 90% have an economic incentive to vote for ever more tax and spend, and that's most of us. So for you and me, the likelihood is every pound we put in, we get more than a pound out. That means we want more tax and spend. That means we want to keep pushing the tax and spend ratchet. That means we are very amenable to the politics of entitlement. I'm a poor man. I'm in this poor group. It's called the bottom 90% of the population. Therefore, I'm entitled to more money. Give me more money because I'm in this poor group. My economic identity is that of a poor man. I'm entitled to more. And that in turn makes us much more tolerant of the politics of ethnic and racial identity, ethnic and racial entitlement. So that is why we are putting up, so many of us, we grumble about refugees welcome, we grumble about the effect on towns and cities, we grumble about the cultural and demographic effect, but we don't do anything about it. And I think that explains why. And I think that is likely to carry on for some time yet, because I think the economy will hold up for some years yet. I would say another 5 or 6 years before the cracks really start to appear to most of us sort of openly. You can see them if you look for them now. You can see they're coming, but I think it'll be 5 to 6 years before those cracks really start to appear to everyone. I would say between 5 and 10 years before things really start to break down. And I think, again, if you look at this graph, I think this graph explains why such a breakdown is unavoidable. If the top 10% pay 60% of income tax, you are going to get more ever more demands for tax and spend. That tax and spend ratchet will keep increasing and increasing, as it has done for decades. And there will always be a politician, a nice politician, Blair was the classic example, who can come along and look really businesslike and efficient and tell you, yes, the economy can't afford to spend more money on you, so vote for me. And we will fall for it. We will do it. And that, in a welfare democracy, the welfare will eventually bankrupt and break the democracy. And that is what I think is likely to happen. And that graph there explains it. When that happens, then I think you will see ordinary people waking up in a very bad, very cold-hearted, very realistic, tough-minded mood. And then, let me just do this. When that happens, I think you will see that people will have no truck for the politics of racial and ethnic entitlement amongst foreign groups that a lot of us don't naturally feel a lot of affinity for. And then I think things will change fast. And then we will look at that Batley and Spen result, we will look at that ridiculous and revolting demo in Glasgow, and we will wonder how it ever happened